So everybody, welcome to Kigali Foreign Affairs Council. We're very excited everybody could join us this afternoon. We have Professor Paul from Oxford. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. It's very exciting for the conversation. I just started your book this weekend, so the new book. So it's very interesting already so far. And Dr. Richard, thank you very much for moderating the conversation today. We're very excited to have you here today. So before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind everybody two things. One is we are on the record, and just everybody to know that. And second, please, we're going to have the last 10 minutes of the conversation where our audience can ask questions. Please send your questions now as we go through the conversation. And then the last 10 minutes, Dr. Richard is going to open up for the audience questions. Without taking so much time, Dr. Richard, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, listen, well, thank you very much. And thank you to the Kigali Foreign Affairs Council for the invitation to participate. And it's wonderful to be on a panel with Paul Collier. I'm only disappointed that he's made me look bad by wearing a necktie. I've never seen Paul wear a necktie before. So in any event, I'm delighted to be participating in this conversation. Paul, let me start by asking you a question about the sort of post-pandemic recovery. You know, 2020 was a terrible year, particularly for Uganda, some 8% of GDP lost. But the signs of recovery are now becoming pretty strong in the global economy, and I think even throughout Africa. My question to you is, what changes do you see coming out of the global economy that will be different than when we went into the pandemic, and what opportunities might this offer for Rwanda looking forward?
Thanks, Richard. I should first, as you say, this is the first time you've ever seen me in a tie, and let me actually explain that, because it's a very sad explanation. This is a black tie, and this is done in honor of a terrible East African loss that has just occurred in the form of Governor Benno Ndulu, the great East African former governor of the central bank, former executive director of the African Economic Research Consortium. For me, he was a very close friend of pretty well 40 years. We'd worked together both in Tanzania, in Nairobi, in Washington, and in Oxford. And so this is a very sad day for East Africa, and I just wanted to show my respect for Benno and for his contribution. Benno was a great man, and he was a man that East Africa really needed at the right time. He was a major contributor to East African economic policy, and many of the achievements of great men occur after they have passed on, because they become a source of influence and inspiration for the next generation. And I believe that is a very important, very valuable thing that Benno himself would have hoped, wanted, and himself strived for in his life. And so I just, across our young audience, I just first want to draw your attention to Benno Ndulu and his amazing achievements, a life he lived for East African society. He's an inspiration. So that's the sad explanation for why, for once, and it is indeed the first time that we should ever see it, I have worn a tie. It's in honor of a close friend of the great man. And now, Richard, let me turn to your question, which is about the devastation caused by COVID, the changes that will be brought about, and the difference that it will make looking forward. And the first and most honest part of the answer that I'll give is that we still don't know. The COVID crisis was an example of a phenomenon known as radical uncertainty. And radical uncertainty is itself a very important and relatively recent concept in economics. For much of my lifetime, economists wildly overestimated how thoroughly we understood the world. And we don't understand it that well. We cannot understand it. And there's a very important book, which I'll just show to you. And here it is. It's called Radical Uncertainty, and it came out just a few months ago, and it is by John Kay, Mervyn King. John Kay, my author in my latest book, Greed is Dead. So I am now steeped in the principles of radical uncertainty, which is what do you do when you don't understand what's going on, you don't know what is best to do. And there are a few principles of radical uncertainty which can guide us. And one is try to avoid doing things that cause irreversible damage. So, for example, Africa was very, very short of firms. Firms are the organizational capital of the private activity of business. And so, at all costs, it was important to try and protect Africa's firms from going bankrupt. And Africa struggled with that because African governments didn't have enough fiscal space to do very much. A country like Germany put in 10% of GDP into protecting its firms. No African country had 10% of GDP to do that. And so the right institutions for that were the development finance institutions around the world. They needed to step up and protect the firms that they were working with. And they've not done a great job of it, to be honest. So that's been a big weakness, which any understanding of radical uncertainty would have told you, no, you've got to spend money on making sure that you don't do the irreversible damage of losing many of the firms that you've got. Right? So that was one principle of radical uncertainty. A second principle is if you don't know, try and find out. And find out by experiments. Try things. And around Africa, COVID has on the whole been pretty well handled, better than in Europe, partly because Africans learned fairly rapidly from the terrible diseases that they had in recent years. And so, for example, Rwanda knew very rapidly it's important, modularity is important. You don't want to bring the disease in from other countries. My own country of Britain was disastrously foolish. There were still planes coming in from Wuhan, right through. I mean, it was utterly irresponsible. Rwanda behaved very well, and promptly, at great cost, shutting down its connectivity with the world. And that was the right thing to do. It was very painful because by the time that happened, I was in Rwanda just before everything closed down. I was probably one of the last visitors in, and by the time when I visited, a government minister told me we have become the second most visited country in Africa. the second most visited country in Africa. That was an astonishing achievement, right? Astonishing. Nobody would have dreamed that that was possible 10 years previously. But Rwanda did some very clever experimental things, investing in game parks. People want to come and look at animals. Well, if you don't have enough animals, bring them in, right? Which Rwanda did, brilliant. Why do a lot of people travel? Conferences. Well, let's set up a conference center. Brilliant, brilliant. Right?
So, but let me just sort of cut in on that point, because in fact, the opportunities because of, or the problem that COVID has created is, of course, there's a huge decline in tourism throughout Africa. I mean, this is, and the world. I mean, there's been, the WTTC estimated that we saw an 80% decline, or nearly an 80% decline in tourist expenditures. At the same time, what we're seeing is meetings like this, you know, the proliferation of Zoom, the proliferation of electronic communication has just skyrocketed in a way that would not have happened or was happening only at the margin prior to the pandemic. In the case of Rwanda, do you see opportunities that come out of these changed global structures that maybe they can take advantage of and make it the most visited country in Africa?
Yeah, how to become number one. Let me sketch that. Partly, Richard, because we've all been cooped up in meetings like this for a year, there is a huge, huge pent-up demand to meet each other in person. Huge. And so there will be an explosion in demand to go to places to meet people, but only those places that are safe. Safe in every sense. Safe in medically and safe in the streets. Rwanda, I mean, what's going to happen quite clearly is travel corridors. The countries that have got to safety will permit travel by vaccine passport and such like with other countries that have got to safety. So Rwanda's made a big investment in safety. And it already has made a big investment in having safe streets. I've walked safely on my own through Kigali streets at midnight, something I would not dream of doing in my own capital city. Right? And so safe on the streets, safe from COVID. There will be an explosion in demand. Now, how can that be combined with Zoom? What we've learned is that a very good way of running a conference that will reach even more people is a mixture. So you offer your audience access on Zoom, but also come if you like, and there will be a privileged access to some things for people who come. Believe me, people will want to meet other people in person. So that's a very big opportunity for Rwanda that you've achieved by very wise investments during the pandemic.
I like this formulation, and in fact, I think Rwanda Air has the opportunity to work with international carriers to do things like have vaccination passports, and I think that's coming eventually.
That's coming pretty rapidly.
Let me turn the question to another topic. In your book, The Future of Capitalism, a terrific book, by the way, you highlight the problem of alienation and inequality. And of course, this is not a problem that is solely confined to the rich countries, and of course that was the focus of your book. Inequality is a problem in Africa as well. In fact, Zia Qureshi at Brookings has just released an article focusing on technology and inequality and saying we're on the brink of a pandemic of inequality. What policies do you think Africa and maybe Rwanda specifically can take to kind of offset any kind of market-driven tendencies towards inequality?
Yeah, so there are, the two big inequalities I highlight in the future of capitalism are spatial inequalities between a capital city and elsewhere in the country, and an educational inequality between the people who get a good education and everybody else. But let's apply that to Rwanda. I've been working for the last 2 years, as you know, as chair of an advisory board to the city of Kigali. And our instructions from the president were make sure that Kigali isn't the congested and unlivable place that some of the other big cities around East Africa have become. And so far, Kigali is actually a very good place, both to be productive and to live. So far, that's sort of stayed on track. But on my last visit, I was visited by the Minister of Local Government, who the whole committee of us, with the advisory committee for the Kigali, and he said, if you don't mind, from now on, you're appointed as advisors to all the urbanization in Rwanda, because we don't want things just happening in Kigali. We want a widely distributed strategy for all the towns and cities across Rwanda. We don't want just Kigali or nothing. Now, I thought that was very far-sighted, but I have to say I worked with a lot of African governments on urbanization. I ran a whole team of cities at work. And to be honest, Rwanda is the only country that has come to us and said, we want a policy that works not just for the capital city, but for all our cities. And so that Rwanda has stepped up an ability to think ahead. This, incidentally, is something I picked up a long time ago in Singapore. The ability to spot a problem when it's just emerging and act before it becomes a nightmare. So that's the spatial inequality. Rwanda's already got policies that are focusing on that. The inequality in skills education, that's something that's also very, very important. Making sure that the training system doesn't just work for the people at the top. Of course, we need to pick up people who are cognitively gifted and fit them to appropriately important jobs. But the skill and energy in society is potentially across the board. The Industrial Revolution in Britain a couple of 100 years ago didn't happen with the very educated people in London at the time, or Oxford. In fact, it completely missed Oxford and Cambridge. It started in northern provincial towns and cities with local entrepreneurs coming up with little ideas and trying them, and local people with a bit of money supporting them. And so that ability to harness the entrepreneurial opportunities across a society, that's really, really important. And that's to connect, you can think of a society as generating sparks of ideas. And then those sparks of ideas need to be connected to fuel, financial fuel, that ignites those sparks and becomes a business that employs people and grows. And so you need to make sure that those sparks can find the fuel of finance.
Yeah. No,
That's local banks, it's local venture capital and such like.
Yeah, no, and I think your point, particularly on education, is really important. In the case of Rwanda, while they've done spectacularly well in many areas, this is one area where they probably could lift their game, even in comparison with the rest of Africa. And what we know is that paper that Chuma and I have just done on the skill-intensive growth path that is likely to emerge, even in Rwanda, tends to pull up the wages of the skilled while leaving the wages of the unskilled behind. So to modulate that, education, as you say, I think is going to be really important going forward.
Yeah, and of course, Rwanda, like everywhere else in Africa, it's huge opportunity, it's huge advantage, it's a youthful population. Now, whether youth becomes an advantage or not depends upon how rapidly the economic structure of the society is changing. What youth is really, really good for is adopting and adapting new stuff. What youth is bad at, necessarily, is that it lacks a lot of experience in very old stuff. And so where youth is really, really valuable is where the structure of economic activity is changing rapidly. Because then there are new things to catch on to. And the people who can catch on fastest are the young. Why did Google send a team to Kenya? Not to teach the Kenyans how to do things, but to learn from Kenyans how to use stuff, So that trying to get as rapid a change as possible in the structure of the economy, that's the trick. And the tragedy is that across Africa, despite this label structural adjustment, Africa has actually had very little adjustment in its economic structures over the last 50 years. And paradoxically, the society that now has the most change in its economic structure is China, and China's demography is really working against it. Mm-hmm. China is running out of young people. And so all the new activities, they're better based in Africa, but only in those African environments where the policy environment encourages new stuff, experiment.
No, this is a huge challenge for Africa, I think. Let me switch topics just for a minute to focus a little bit on the role of development assistance in this process. We know that throughout Africa, the pandemic has caused governments to increase expenditures rather substantially. At the same time, revenues have fallen, increasing, of course, the near-term fiscal deficits, right? Those deficits need to have financing. How do you see the role of development assistance? Because at the same time, of course, the rich countries are undergoing some of the same constraints. In your country, the UK, the government has been forced to reduce expenditures on development assistance from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP. What can Africa and perhaps OEC or the donor countries do together to mobilize more finance so that coming out of the pandemic recession and managing the need for fiscal consolidation over a longer period of time doesn't force African governments to choose between inflationary finance and harsh austerity?
Yeah. So there's a silver lining in all this, right? And the silver lining is that there's a huge global mismatch, that the uncertainty caused by COVID has pushed up savings rates that were already high. People are a bit scared, and so they want to save. At the same time, it's pushed down global rates of investment. People don't want to commit to spending money. As a result of that, interest rates, which equilibrate saving and investment, have collapsed to zero. For safe havens for savings, interest rates are now negative. So at the worst, you can borrow for free. You can borrow 10 years for free. My own university, Oxford, has borrowed £700 million, about $1 billion, on a 100-year bond. We don't have to pay it back for a century. Right? We borrowed it at 2%. Right? Inflation in Britain is going to be about 2%, so we borrowed for free. Right? Germany is doing even better. You can borrow, the German government can borrow for 10 years and pay less back than what it borrowed. Yeah? People pay it to take their money. Yeah? So everything that Africa pays, everything is a payment for the risk that you won't be paid back. Now, this is a huge opportunity for organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, because they can borrow for free. Yeah? They're AAA rated, they can borrow for free. Yeah? And so that's the big, big opportunity. The IMF and the World Bank should borrow for free and on lend, so de-risked borrowing to African governments, borrow for free. And that's how African governments can then use that money to stabilize and revive their economies. Of course, they should be running fiscal deficits at the moment. Of course, they should. That's not imprudent. But should they be borrowing at 7% in order to do it? No. Italy, you know, in Europe faced this problem during the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And the governor of the central bank, European Central Bank at the time, Mario Draghi, understood this. And so he said, we just want to do whatever it takes. And as soon as he said that, the interest rates that Italy could borrow at fell from about 7% to about 1.5%. That's the action that is needed now at Africa.
Now, for that to work, I think the World Bank in particular would have to change some of its practices, particularly in lending non-concessional IBRD funds, that is, not IDA funds, but funds that are pegged to LIBOR, or they're not, with a small markup, right? Should the bank be doing this? And Rwanda, I think, has had some eligibility to this, but hasn't really taken advantage of it.
Of course it should. It should do it big time. Just before COVID, I was invited to an anniversary meeting of the founding of the World Bank by the Banque de France. And I was privileged to speak just after the president of the World Bank, before an audience of the very great and the very good of French society. For example, Monsieur Trichet, the former governor of the EBRD, of the European Bank, and so on and so forth. And what I reminded them was the first IBRD loan, so the first non-concessional loan that the World Bank ever made. And it was in 1947, and it was big. It was the equivalent of about $2.8 billion. So this was a big loan. And it was made to France. Now, France in 1947 was not France now. 1947, France was on its knees. It had a big communist party. It had just emerged from being devastated by a world war. It was incredibly fragile. To all intents and purposes, France in 1947 was a fragile state. But very sensibly, the board of the World Bank recognized that it was a vital matter for the interest of Europe and America that France should not collapse. And so a loan with a one-page letter agreed with the Minister of Finance of 2.8 billion was to rebuild France. And that was how it was used. It ushered in what is known in France still as the 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of fast growth. That's what Africa needs. So it's not that the bank should change its policies. It should readopt the policies it had when IBRD was founded. In 1947, what the bank did not do was go to kids in hedge funds and day traders in capital markets and say, what's the credit score for France at the moment? Because the credit for France in 1947 would have been terrible. Of course they didn't do that. They said this is a public interest of vital proportions. We'll lend you 2.8 billion as long as you use it sensibly for infrastructure.
Well, this is a good message both to Rwanda and to the World Bank, frankly. And
of course, people of the standing of President Kagame can ask similar position by Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia, or by the President of Ghana, President of Senegal. These are the people, none of those four are eligible at the moment for IBRD. Yeah. That is a disgrace and a folly. And the World Bank's board needs to be pulled up and corrected.
Good. I think I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Yannick, the president of the Kigali Foreign Affairs Council. We've overrun our time here, Paul.
Sorry.
You know, we want to talk a lot. There's a lot to cover. But Yannick, back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. So we have a couple of questions, Professor, coming in. The first question comes from Dr. James from the University of Rwanda. And his question is, how important is multilateralism, specifically with COVID happening and World Health Organization?
How important is what?
How important multilateralism is? Like multilateralism. Like how important is international organization now?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Multilateralism.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah. It's very important because each individual country, as Richard says, is a bit stressed fiscally. But the world as a whole, through our multilateral institutions like the World and the IMF, are not stretched in the least. They've never been able to borrow so much so cheaply. People are just queuing up to buy AAA rated bonds at any interest rate. You know, please take the money. And so we have a solution that is costless, but it depends upon doing it multilaterally. No individual government wants to risk it. That's why, for example, Britain, rather than borrow, has cut its aid program, right? Which is a tragedy. But that's why we built multilateral institutions. Both the World Bank, the IMF, and the European Union. These are institutions. Their hour is now. But they must use them. They must be bold.
Okay. The next question comes from Manzi, African Leadership University. What Africa can learn from Brexit and EU?
Okay, so Brexit was was a mutiny, not really against Brussels, but against London. The only part of Britain to vote to remain in Europe was London. Every region of England and Wales outside London voted to leave. And that was really, of course, over the past 40 years, Britain has completely neglected both the provinces outside London. And so growth became ridiculously skewed towards London. And it neglected the people who didn't go to university.
Yeah.
And so it was the people who didn't go to university, whose skills were becoming less valuable, and the people who didn't live in London. They were the people who voted for Brexit because there was a chance to draw attention to their problems. And it's worked. And for the first time in 40 years, a British government is now giving priority to equalizing the big gulf spatially and equalizing the big gulf between the well-educated and everybody else. That mutiny would not have been necessary if those problems had been addressed earlier. So the lesson of Brexit for everybody else is don't let these deep rifts open up.
The next question is from Claudette. Her question is, in terms of development, what mistakes can African and developing countries learn from developed countries? And her question is like, what kind of mistake can we avoid as Africa is developing?
Yes, so it's really the same. It's the same answer to a question that's worded differently. Avoid these big divides. You need a development which really does encourage innovation, but which is inclusive. Enterprise and initiative can be found all over a country, and not just amongst the educated either. So tap into enterprise and initiative wherever it is. Right? That's really the message. Innovate, yes. If you don't innovate, you'll perish. But you've got this huge asset of young people like yourself. Right? And that is a massive asset, which countries like mine have much less of. Countries like mine are full of people that look like myself and like Richard.
Speak for yourself, Paul.
Sorry, Richard. Around us full of people who look like you and do what you're best at, which is be creative, I'm terrified by these new technologies. My son isn't,
The next question is a little bit touchy. It's about China. And Dr. Ndaisawa asks, what's your thought on China in Africa?
Okay, so it's a very important question, and it's not a straightforward answer. China can be very valuable for Africa. It can also be very dangerous. One thing you've always got to remember about China is that China is operating in the interest of China. They talk about mutual advantage, mutual benefit. And that's a fine phrase, and potentially it's a very good concept. I think mutual benefit is a very good thing. You should get it. It's much less patronizing than the European donor idea of, we'll give you money, aren't we good people, do what we tell you, right? So I'd much rather have mutual benefit, but what China means by mutual benefit is we will look after the Chinese interests. We suppose you'll look after yours. And on the whole, African governments haven't been sufficiently careful of looking after their own interests. And so it's easy to be lured into problems in which you borrow money from China and then you're caught in a trap.
Thank you, Professor. So we run over time. It's already 10 more minutes. I want to say thank you very much, Professor Paul and Dr. Richard, for the great conversation today. We hope after COVID, we'll have you in Rwanda and have a long conversation in person with everybody. And for the audience, I'm sorry we couldn't ask all the 42 questions you sent, guys, but I'm sure there's another opportunity where we'll have and sit and have a conversation. Thank you very much.
You won't be able to keep us out. Thanks very much.
Good,
thank you, Yannick. This has been a delightful conversation, and good to see you again, Paul.
Yeah, and you, Richard.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.